And hello everybody. Today is going to be a special stream where I'm actually going to be talking about what went into the creation and all of the refining that went into the Magic Online Proliferate Cube. So, for anybody who is not familiar with it, the Proliferate Cube is a recent one that was put up over on Magic Online, and it is basically completely committed to getting as many counters as possible onto the battlefield and then doing things that actually care about them, So let's see here. I'm putting this up right now, pulling up the chat, and let me pop that out really quick. And what I'm going to do, so I've got the full cube list pulled up just to reference it for a second. And I'm going to drop this in chat. Add command cube list. All right, so cube list, if anyone else wants to reference everything, or at least the final product, this is the base level idea, or this is the final product that everybody can look at here. I hope everybody is doing okay today. I see a few people hanging out in chat already, which is a pretty cool sign. Cannot complain about that. So, the baseline for this cube is Allie Steele actually reached out to me and said, "Hey, I saw that you built a peasant cube back in the day, and I know you worked before designing a brawl deck for us. Have you done any other cubes lately? We're looking for some other folks to maybe have their cubes spotlighted with our Cube Spotlight series, and your name's come up a couple times as a result of those things. What do you think? What do you got going on?" And I said, "No, I don't have anything right now. The last couple of years for me have just kind of been dominated by competitive play. But that doesn't mean it's impossible for me to do that." And I said, what kinds of things were you possibly thinking? She said, the sky is the limit. What do you like to do in Magic? Because the more passionate you are about something, the more you're going to understand it, the better something's going to turn out, and so on. So I took a couple days to kind of think about it, and I realized the things that I liked the most and the limited formats I liked the most were the formats where people were mostly playing to the battlefield and the high complexity draft formats. So War of the Spark was actually the original inspiration for this cube. I was looking at doing War of the Spark remastered, sort of how Elliot Raff had the Khans cube, which was just reimagined Khans of Tarkir, fleshing out the themes with a wider card pool. So I originally started looking at a lot of planeswalkers and thinking about how I would balance against the best planeswalkers ever, right? You can't have War of the Spark remastered and not have Nissa Who Shakes the World. You can't have it without Jace the Mind Sculptor or Liliana of the Veil. And I came to realize pretty quickly with that, as I started to flesh that card list out, that the better decks didn't look that different than the best modern cube decks, right? Because Planeswalker is just a card type from the modern era. That means most of the power cards or the showcase cards, the things that you actually want to be the stars of your gameplay or the coolest pack one pick ones that people slam, are going to be those planeswalkers, and are generally going to be planeswalkers that are already in modern cube, since modern cube and also to an extent legacy and vintage cube are going to be these modern legal cards. And having something that felt like it was just another flavor of modern cube or legacy cube is just not really where I wanted to be. It felt like if I was given the opportunity to put as much work into this as I wanted to put into it to make sure it was a great product, I didn't want it to just be another version of something else, right? So I ended up trying to think about what else can I do? What did I like about War of the Spark? And Proliferate was a big thing that came up. Whenever I came back to Magic, I quit for 6-8 months, something like that, back in 2010. Came back in 2011. The first deck I played when I got back was a blue-white Proliferate deck with Vincer the Sojourner. I think I had Squadron Hawk in there. It's just a bunch of blockers. but it had Contagion Clasp, it had a bunch of cool stuff. But ultimately, the stars of the show were the different counters and synergies you could proliferate with those, and Tumble Magnet and so on. So I actually just wanted to try and say, let's build a cube around counters. Let's try and make Proliferate be the star of the show, because there are so many cards throughout Magic's history that do get pushed whenever you just resolve something like Volt Charge, right? That's just an open fire, so 3 mana, deal 3 to anything, and then Proliferate. That kind of card is so close in so many formats to being incredible, and I just wanted to make it incredible, right? Be it Contentious Plan, Steady Progress, Throne of Geth, all of these cards felt like there was enough there to actually build an entire format around it. So, the first thing that I actually did, and this took me about 10 hours, and actually, maybe it's better for me to start off on the original site that I was on. So I ended up on Cube Cobra, but I believe Cube Tutor is where I actually started. So I started this back before Core Set 2021 came out. This took me about 5 months from inception to publishing, maybe 6. Yeah, okay, so I'm over on Cube Tutor right now, and the first card I added was Glistener Elf, because in my mind, one of the coolest things that you can proliferate is counters on players. That was something that was incredibly unique feeling. So the first things I actually looked at were Infect, were Energy, and were Experience counters, because those were the counters that players can get in the game. So I shoved a bunch of those in there, and I wanted to make sure that I tried to make the game actually work for those. So the first thing I did, I knew I had to have a cube that was 600 cards, but I knew with this top-down style of cubing, I wanted to make sure that I actually ended up with a playable cube and that I had as many options available to me as possible. So I started out over on Scryfall, and color by color, I literally put a color in, and then in type line, I typed the word counter, and I hit search. And you know what? Something came up. Oh, I put that in card type. That's the problem. There we go. So we have 252 different white cards in the game, mono white cards that involve the word counter. And from there, I just kind of looked at the cards that said, hey, do these cards actually stand on their own? Do they encourage unique gameplay, or is the gameplay fun? Are these cards that can win a game? Because something that I knew would come up and would likely end up being a problem is, like with any format where everything that matters is combat and playing to the battlefield, you need to have ways to actually break through a board stall. Sometimes that means flying. Abzan Falconer, for example, is a great example of a card where you don't just have two people staring at each other where nobody can actually profitably attack, because whoever attacks first loses the game after the other player gets to make a bunch of profitable blocks. And, or you just had a way to snowball an advantage early. So I literally went one by one, and every single card I saw that I could think of that I thought would encourage kind of normal gameplay or just be a counters card that could play on its own, I ended up adding to the Cube Tutor list. So you can see a ton of cards here. I added about 100 at a time or so. Like here we even have a bunch of monocolor cards. I added a bunch of iconic ones. Some things I searched by actual keyword, because I wanted to make sure that they were cool. I don't actually think I started on the color white. I think I started on the color black. It doesn't really matter that much. I ended up with some very specific searches. If you go back through my Twitter history, you can find little Easter eggs of when I was, in hindsight, was obviously working on this cube, where I thought, hey, wow, Scryfall, I'm trying to make this happen, but I'm struggling pretty hard to actually come up with a search parameter for this that does not include this or does not include this. And one of the big ones that actually came up was having blue where it did not involve counter spell, because there are a certain number of cards that involve counters when you cast the spell, like Aether Figment has spell in the reminder text for kicker, but it does involve counters, and so you don't want it to get excluded when you're searching, or you don't want these kinds of cards to get excluded, but you also don't want the card cancel to come up when you're trying to find +1 counter synergies. So the wonderful people at Scryfall were absolutely incredible about helping me filter out certain kinds of cards, even without knowing that it would be for the Magic Online cube. But the people at Scryfall are wonderful. They've not paid me to say anything about like this or whatever. I'm just very thankful that they were responsive and great, did a bunch of work to help me. Anyway, one of the big things that I quickly ended up noticing was that there were not, I think I might have originally searched +1 counter as well, just to see if there was a way to make that be the theme, because ultimately I did want it to be based around combat math. I wanted that to be the sort of star of the show. And +1 counters and keyword counters, even though those are really only home and Ikoria, right? +1 counters are the easiest things that meaningfully impact positioning on the battlefield or sizing, which is everything whenever combat math is the star of the show. One of the things I quickly noticed is that blue did not have nearly as many +1 counters as every single other color, right? In white, you have sort of the outlast mechanic, you have a bunch of things that pump your whole team. In black, you have things like Carrion Feeder, or you have Undying, or you have things like Woe Strider, where that ends up being relevant. Red, you would be amazed at how many +1 counters end up how frequently +1 counters are used by design to make early threats scale into the late game. Things Stormblood Berserker, things Stromkirk Noble, and so on. And then in green, I don't think I have to explain all the ways that green uses +1 counters, right? There's Hydras, there's the Stompy creatures, but blue did not actually have a ton of these +1 counter abilities. So that is about when I actually started searching just the word counter instead. And the coolest thing that I came up with that actually helped a ton is the suspend mechanic, where instead of being necessarily a proliferate cube, I could lean into being a counters cube, where I tried to make just counters on everything the star of the show. And it isn't just cards with suspend that ended up making it into the final cube, right? I don't think there are a ton of cards. Let's actually filter really quick. Text has suspend. There are 15 cards in the whole set that actually have suspend, or something like that, 17. But most of them are in blue because they do play to this sort of tempo-y game plan that blue is known for in the cube. The original version of the cube, it had Aeon Chronicler, it had Errant Ephemeron, which was a find from Modern Masters 1, because I went through in a bunch of master sets to see what archetypes they had, to see what cool stuff I could dig up from there. And Riftwing Cloudskate is in Ancestral Vision are both very, very popular cards from regular cube, right? Everyone loves a good Riftwing Cloudskate. But something else I found while looking for suspend things, because I eventually was just searching suspend, was the card Clock Spinning, which kind of led me to the idea that blue did not necessarily have to have its own counters. A lot of blue's power in this cube, and something you'll see in the final product a good bit, is blue actually works a lot with manipulating counters. So you end up with cards like Clock Spinning, like Fate Transfer, and so on, that move counters around a lot. And blue, rather than necessarily always being the star of the show, blue somehow ends up being the combat trick color. You know what I mean? That's one of the most interesting parts about blue in this cube, I think, or at least one of my favorite parts about blue in this cube is it operates on an axis that we aren't really used to seeing out of blue. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that this entire cube is based around a sort of unique axis, right? Not that every set doesn't have some sort of counters, but the emphasis is being placed on this specific axis in such a way that cards that normally would not be particularly valuable are now some of the best picks in the whole thing, right? I talked about it in Good Morning Magic with Gavin Verhey, but I think one of the strongest pack one pick ones, or at least one of the most versatile ones, is just Fate Transfer, which for those who are not familiar with that card, I'm just going to pull that one up on the screen really quick. And as I talk about cards, I'll try to have a way to put that in. Fate Transfer is just a UB hybrid in 1 instant. Move all counters from target creature onto another target creature. This is fairly iconic, or at least fairly representative of what we want blue to be doing in the cube, in a way that even if blue cards don't have a ton of counters, you still get to play with them a good bit. One of the most awkward things about blue is the most counter-centric, or how do I put this? Of all the blue mechanics and times throughout Magic, the time that blue has cared the most about counters has been in Simic specifically, throughout all of the different iterations of Ravnica that we've seen. But let's look at the evolve mechanic. There are 4, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4 mono blue cards with the evolve mechanic. And I'm going to level with y'all. I'm not putting Clinging Anemones in my cube. This card's not really playable on its own. We do have Cloudfin Raptor, Simic Flux Mage, and Simic Manipulator, but really only the first and last one here are things you're excited about. The same can be said for basically all of the other mechanics. Like, so we have Evolve. Graft is another one where so Xenograft doesn't actually have the graft mechanic. And of the others, most of these cards aren't playable. So even though blue has 3 different instances of being involved in a color pair where everything involves +1 counters, there are 15 cards throughout all of Magic that were mono blue and cared about counters. It was kind of absurd and pretty frustrating, but that discovery of actually leaning into manipulating counters ended up doing wonders for building the cube and finding a way to let things sort of gel together. All right, so here we have me going through finding every instance of the word counter and putting it in. So this was before I really had a fleshed out cube. At this point, I had, of 600 cards, I think I had like 900 or something. You can just see this is all me just adding cards. I wish I could go back and look at the history of these. I don't know if you could do that on Cube Tutor. Okay, then when I saw how many cards there were, I had to actually go through and see what cards I wanted to be cutting, which ones I thought were not very strong, and a couple of things stuck out to me pretty quickly. Okay, so first of all, what's worth noting is there are 600 cards, right? I had my original instructions were that I had to have a 600 card cube. Later, I was told it could be as little as 540, but the idea is you want there to be a bunch of replayability with the cube, and you don't want every version of a certain archetype to just kind of look the same, right? You want people to feel like they're getting a unique experience every time they play a new draft, and I think that's valid. You're able to replay Moto Cube a lot more than you could a Paper Cube, so I think Paper Cube 360 is about where you want to be, because you want to make sure no one's Splinter Twin deck or whatever gets gutted when they go to someone's house to cube for a night. But on Moto, where you just get to click replay over and over, I think that's super valid. Sunbird, appreciate 2 months of subs. You are awesome. Thank you so much for that. But that 600 number, that's very relevant, because at a single table, you are going to have 45 cards per player, right? 3 15-card packs times 8 players is 360 cards. So that means that players were only going to be seeing about 60% of the cube each time they sat down. not each player, but the whole table was only going to see right under 2/3 of the total cube. That meant that having those kinds of having any mechanic where you needed to have multiple cards of your mechanic to fit in, you need to have that mechanic be very present in order for it to be seen enough. So the first couple things this did in, ironically, were both energy and infect. So let's just take a look really quick. There are a grand total of, let's take the color off of that. There are a grand total of 67 total cards with the word infect on them. And they are not even all infect creatures. A lot of these are situations where it just says, like, it has the card name in it, right? So let's just change it to say infect poison, just in case. Oh, okay. Well, you know what? We're just going to leave it at the word infect because it's being obnoxious. But you end up in a spot where you have to look at how many of these cards are actually playable. So again, we have 67 cards in all of Magic where their text box has the word infect in them. And let's assume, not to get too not to get too Shapiro about it, let's assume. Let's assume there are 60 of these total are infect creatures that we want to put in the cube. We then have to assume that only 36 of those are going to make it to the table, and you want to play enough of them to actually justify playing an infect deck. You need to play roughly 10, 12 infect creatures for infect to really feel like it's worth it. Otherwise, you're going to end up in spots where you deal 6 or 7 points with Blighted Agent and Blackleaf Goblin, and then they die, and it just feels like you didn't actually do anything with those creatures because the rest of your creatures are dealing regular combat damage. So I ended up adding every semi-playable infect creature, and some of them I don't think it's realistic to count. Like Blightsteel Colossus, for example, is not something that you are actually counting towards your infect creature dex total. Chainthroat Seeker, same story. And I ended up only coming up with, I think it was 25 or 30 creatures that I thought could stand up to the power level of the rest of the cube. And this is relevant when talking about power level to the rest of the cube, because something that is going to be very relevant in this cube in particular is the fact that sizing on creatures is going to be larger and more relevant than normal. So that's a very big deal, because it means that some of these weaker creatures, like Blackleaf Goblin, being a 4-mana 2/1, even with haste and infect, is just not going to connect most of the time if your cube is built around a bunch of like grizzly bears that get counters put on them, right? So I ended up scrapping the infect mechanic for this reason. Then I had a similar problem. Oh, okay, hold on. I have to do this weird, right? How do you find energy? Because it's reminder text. You have to find the actual symbol. Either way, I can't find it very easily. There are like 35 total cards that reference energy. Thank you. All right, let's pull it up. 70. So there are 70 total cards, and only about 30 to 35 of them that are worth seeing play. And a lot of those were contingent upon you having other cards that cared about energy, right? So something like Scrapper Champion, for example, is fine, but ultimately you want it to have energy or something for it to be good. There are even some things like Gaunty's Aetherheart and Aetherworks Marvel that were in the original versions of the cube, because proliferating the energy for those to get them closer to their big payoff sounds awesome. But when you don't have any other forms of energy, that's kind of embarrassing. And then cards like Woodweaver's Puzzle Knot, where all they do is serve to actually provide more energy, just end up being 15th picks a lot of the time whenever you don't have other energy sources. Whirler Virtuoso is actually another great example of a card like this, where it was in the cube's first draft, but got cut pretty quickly when it became that this card is kind of just a rough... Is it Rogue Thopterist? Is that the name of the red one? Something like that. Either way, the red one that gives your artifact creatures haste. Anyway, I ended up cutting most of the energy cards as a result of that as well, because despite them looking awesome on paper, they didn't play very well. Thopter Engineer. Thank you, Elliot. Let's see. Yeah, here is the spot where you can see me actually cutting all of the... Not all. Most of the infect creatures. I left a couple of them in, but... You know, we can see Ichor Rat's Contagious Nim, Corpse Cur, Flinzermite, etc. We only had a handful of infect creatures that I thought could actually stand up to the other cards, and then I realized this is only 15, 20 infect creatures. These gotta be better, or they're just not gonna cut it. Alright, here is cutting a bunch of energy cards. Then I had to check on counters in artifacts, which I had not gotten to yet. That ended up being a really big deal because obviously artifacts frequently care about counters. And then the biggest issue here is finding a way to make Arcbound Ravager work in a 600 card cube, because you would be shocked at how hard it is to make an aggressive artifact deck work. Let's just 1 second. All right, so colorless, type line, creature. We want it to be an artifact. Actually, it doesn't even have to be colorless. It's an artifact creature, CMC less than 4. There are 300 total artifact creatures that cost less than 4 in the game of Magic. Now, they also, for the same reason as the infect creatures, have to be playable. That we can't just be putting, like, Aegis Automaton in there, right? A lot of things were just underwhelming in general. Big fan of the Arcbound crew, Arcbound Worker, Arcbound Stinger. Got a lot of inspiration from specifically Modern Hardened Scales, as that just is a counters deck that people like playing with a lot. And it went a long way to informing what cards were good enough. There's also an issue with colorless creatures in particular, where if you have too many things like Chronotomaton or Hangerback Walker or Walking Ballista, those colorless artifact creatures are just going to get sucked up by other drafters at the table. You're just going to end up in a spot where you can't build an artifact deck if you just put a bunch of generic good cards in. So I need to actually include some number of creatures in the vein of, let's see, I think it's Dwyra's Toolbox is the one that I think is a real signpost of what that this is meant to be an archetype. Yeah, here we go. Dwyra's Toolbox. 2 mana, 1/1, tap 2, regenerate target artifact creature. This is exactly the kind of card that is needed to flesh out these aggressive artifact decks. In addition, you really want to make sure that your artifact color is going to have 1, 2, in my case 3 colors where it's the most at home. Otherwise, you're going to end up being your good cards are going to end up being cannibalized by any color drafter at the table, if it's even close to a generic good card. Hey, Party Pat with 3 months of subs. Thank you so much for that. But the point I was just describing a moment ago is actually a big example of why the card Blade Splicer is not in the cube, even though I think the card would be a strong addition if there were to be white aggressive artifact decks. Instead of allowing for that, I very intentionally made it to where there are not very many white or green cards that are very supportive of artifact decks. I know there are some things in green that are good with counters, and that's just kind of hard to avoid. But I did not want players to, when they were drafting the cube, to end up drafting a couple of artifacts, let's say an Etch Champion, and then maybe an Ensoul artifact or something, and then a Blade Splicer, and think that they were going to be able to have a bunch of white artifact support, because there comes a point where you can't have a little bit of artifact support peppered in every single color and then expect to end up with a reasonably playable artifact deck that is 4 colors or something like that. The mana is not good enough, and most of your fixing is going to get sucked up as well, right? Because you're only going to get 2 or 3 colors worth of fixing. You can't play Blade Splicer and Master of Ethereum and Unlicensed Disintegration and expect that to work. And that actually is a great segue into something that I ended up starting out having a few of and then having to cut later on from the Proliferate Cube. Let me pop over to the changes here. I want to find where I cut these. There are okay, here we go. So this is one of the later updates I made to the cube. I originally had a bit of an ally theme because a lot of the allies could kind of stand on their own. Like Kazandu Blademaster is just a great start as a 2-mana 1/1 that gives a counter, so it's a 2/2 with First Strike and Vigilance. So it's a decent body you can proliferate with. And then a couple of other allies to have a minor allies theme with Hada Freeblade and a couple of other cool things. And then I also had Coral Helm Commander as a Grizzly Bear in blue that involved counters and then also scaled into the later stages of the game. You can make it a flyer and eventually an air elemental that pumped your other merfolk. The problem is that having too many cards of these sorts of tribes, even if you have roughly enough cards to make it work, is you end up tricking players who haven't consumed a bunch of content about your cube or maybe don't know the full list of what cards are available. People are going to see something like Coral Helm Commander and get tricked into thinking that Merfolk is a supported strategy. This is very similar to the Blade Splicer problem that I just described. I don't want people to take a Coral Helm Commander and go, hell yeah, I love Merfolk. Let's go. Let's do a Merfolk deck. And then all of a sudden they only see Merfolk Trickster, Harbinger of the Tides, Sage of Fables, Benthic Biomancer, and no other Merfolk are available, right? There were a bunch of cards that actually just involved counters, but I ended up removing at the last second because, like, Cordial Vampire is actually just a 2-mana Mortician Beetle, right? Like, it just pumps itself and puts counters on itself a bunch as it scales, or as creatures die, but because it says put a counter on each vampire you control, I ended up cutting it because I didn't want people... There were just enough vampires that I was afraid people would think vampires was a tribal supported deck, and they would think these sorts of cards were an actual signpost for an archetype, instead of just, hey, this is a fine card that happens to work with the themes of the cube, and any other synergies you get from it are just kind of gravy, rather than something you should care a lot about. One moment. So those kinds of cards are just, like, even if they are good on paper, they end up being the kind of things that when you aren't playing with your play group and you're having to curate a cube for hundreds, thousands, or even thousands of people to play with, you need to make sure that you're not tricking players during the drafting process, right? You can have combat tricks or whatever, but you don't want people that you don't want people to feel like they got tricked at the end of their draft, or like you're more setting players up for disappointment with cards like this, especially in an open cube environment like the MTGO Spotlight Cube, than you are creating situations for people to feel happy with their drafting decisions. So it just feels bad. Like, even if there are points where, like, I had a few changelings to try and maybe offset it a little bit. I had skeletal changeling. I think I have the 1 mana 1/1 changeling out of Modern Horizons. But I think the problem is just that these kinds of cards send a bad signal to a lot of people. Rage Forger is another one where I didn't want people to think that +1 counters were, or that the shamans were a supported archetype. This is a red and 2/2/2 out of Morningtide. When ETBs put a counter on each other shaman you control, and whenever a creature you control with a +1 counter attacks, you may have that creature deal 1 to target player. So in this cube, Rage Forger is much closer functionally to a Hell Rider than it is a Lord, but you don't want players to start just drafting everything they see on it with Shaman because they want Rage Forger to be a Lord. And like, you just don't want to ruin people's play experiences for relatively small upsides like that. You know what I mean? I ended up cutting most of the powerful planeswalkers that were in the cube because I think it is too easy to snowball an advantage while turtling up in front of one. I would rather combat math be a big deal with attacking players than dealing with resources outside of the actual combat itself. If you look at the planeswalkers that are in the cube, so I only have 2 or 3 Ajanis, but almost every Ajani involves counters, which was kind of funny. Seriously, hold on. Let me show y'all just how many Ajanis care about counters. It is kind of preposterous. Card name Ajani. Oh, let's type line Planeswalker so we don't get Ajani's Pride Mates or whatever. Adversary of Tyrants counters. Caller of the Pride counters. Goldmane counters. Mentor of Heroes counters. Steadfast counters. Strength of the Pride counters. Ajani Greathearted counters. Unyielding kind of, but I'm not going to count Unyielding. And then even to a point, Vengeant, Wise Counselor involved them. Like, it was just a preposterous number of Ajani's that care about +1 counters. It was around this time that I ended up cutting all of the energy cards. I think I already covered that a little bit. And this is also around the area. I actually talked to Ryan Overturf about the cube a little bit. He looked over it, gave me some pointers, and the biggest takeaway I got from him was to emphasize gameplay rather than how cool the cube list looks, because people play cubes, they don't read them. You know what I mean? Like, obviously cube aficionados are going to pour over the list and care a lot about how cool something is in theory, but the real money is making sure that you can just actually play the cube and have a lot of fun with it. Ooh, love that. That was nice. Anyway, you want to make sure people actually enjoy your cube, and that's what it's going to be remembered for, is how the games actually play out. And so, to a point, that involved cutting a lot of the thematic cards and then actually trying to make sure that there were cards that just played on their own and created good gameplay. In a lot of cases, this just meant adding more interaction, adding more cards that were familiar to people. Like, originally I had a bunch of cards, like, that I thought were very cool, but I also just didn't think people would recognize, right? So there's a point where opening 15 cards and seeing 12 cards you have to read is not actually very fun, right? You're just, imagine, it's like when you go to a pre-release, but all of the cards are very powerful and new, and you're kind of doing something that is inherently based on doing something nostalgic, right? Cube for a lot of people is more a means to play a different kind of something that they're vaguely familiar with, right? So making sure that there was a good balance of cards that people knew, as well as this sort of unique experience, was a very, very hard one to strike. And I've just been kind of talking for like half an hour now. Does anybody have any questions about anything that I've said so far, or just anything that they want me to touch on? Why no Master Biomancer? So, blue green was actually the color combination that has the most gold cards, and a lot of cool cards just got left on the cutting room floor. Like, hold on, blue green text involves counter 50. 50 cards here involve the word counter, and very few of these, like I'm sure, there's Frilled Mystic and Void Slime in here that involve counter spell, but for the most part, all of these cards involve counters somehow, right? So it came down to me just basically trying to find the balance between wanting to have as many unique effects as possible, because you want to not just have a ton of redundancy in your cube, but you still want everything to kind of head in the same direction. And while Master Biomancer is a very sweet card and was one of my favorite ones to play in Gate Crash, I'm not just saying that, I pinky promise. Hadana's Climb, Varel of the Whole Clade, Azuri Claw of Progress, Bioessence Hydra, and Rolesk all just kind of felt like they had the best balance of 5 unique-ish abilities and cards that people were familiar with. Like, Azuri is one of the things that ended up kind of being a sacred piece that I didn't want to cut, because experience counters were the last bastion of player counters that you can proliferate, and it's also just a cool card. So maybe Master Biomancer should have been in that slot, but I'm fairly confident in the other 4 as pretty cool cards to have included. Did I playtest the cube? I did, actually, Raja. That's the next portion I'm planning on talking about a little bit. Hey, Rain, good to see you. You're gonna ask about control, but then you show all the sweet, sweet Sonic cards. How precise do you have to be about color breakdown and balance? I see that I have different numbers of gold cards. So the gold cards are actually a little bit more complicated, because that is a mix of how frequently I expect people to be drafting this exact color combination, and how many of those cards are actually just hybrid cards, right? So Azorius is one where I have 5 Azorius cards, but I don't actually expect very many people to draft exactly blue-white a ton. So most of these are kind of standalone cards that aren't really synergy pieces. They just are fine, like they're just value flyers for the most part. And then Detention Sphere is a fine, and Royal Spout are fine interactive cards. Like, these are way more generic than, say, Selesnya, which I expected to be drafted very much, because if you read Ryan Overturf's article, he outlines that he just thinks that Selesnya is likely the most powerful color combination. That's why I committed a bit more love to this, because I thought it would be a more contested color, which means it needs to be able to support more drafters at the table, right? It's unlikely you're going to have 2 Azorius drafters at a table, but having 2 Selesnya drafters is not really out of the question. Also, there is a point where a lot of hybrid cards are listed as Selesnya, and they aren't, right? Shalai is the kind of card where this is a white-green card, where it's better if you're Selesnya, but you're not unhappy to have a Shalai in your deck if you're white-black, or even just mono-white or something like that. And some of them are just very much just sort of more monocolor than anything else. Like, I think, might be the color? Oh no, I changed a couple cards at the end. Most colors, though, have 5 gold cards and then some number of hybrid cards, and that's just kind of based on how frequently I thought that color pair would get drafted. Was there any worry about battlefield complexity when starting down this route? I know I mentioned liking the battlefield matter, but it seemed like this type of cube could lead to paralysis from board complexity. Yes, actually. So I touched on it a little bit at the beginning. One of the things that I really emphasized when building the cube and looking at cards that were included is I really, really wanted to make sure that I had enough cards that could break a board stall. So a great example of this is Abzan Falconer. All of your creatures with +1 counters have flying. This means that all of your stuff is pretty close to unblockable whenever this card's on the battlefield, and that's a great way to actually make sure that you can end a game. I think that a lot of the games are going to end up in spots where both players have 3 or 4 creatures and it's hard to actually break through, but having cards like Abzan Falconer is a great way to make sure that isn't always a problem. There are also a lot of other cards in white in particular, like Elite Scale Guard, which just makes it to where they basically can't block, and it is not always the most satisfying end to a game, but I think the interesting games that involve back and forth combat math are interesting enough to justify the cards that create the battlefields that necessitate these board breakers like Elite Scale Guard. There also is the presence of combos in the cube, which makes it kind of forces action on the player who doesn't have a combo available to them, but we can talk more about that later. Was there ever instances of not including cards due to mana costs, or do you feel like the mana fixing in my cube impacted choices I wanted to include? Yes, actually. So I sent the cube in later in the process to Wizards as a sort of first draft. I had to basically prove to them that I was actually doing something. And they had play design, play test it, and get back to me. And one of the big problems that they had with the cube, especially later in the process, was that there were too many colored pips. And that's to say that there were too many cards in the vein of, let me find them, too many cards in the vein of Kargan Dragonlord, where Kargan Dragonlord is very hard to play in a deck that is green-red. That's to say a deck that has like 10 forests and 7 mountains. Kargan Dragonlord barely counts as a 2-drop because it's very hard to cast and then harder to commit mana to leveling up because it needs exactly a ton of red to make that happen. There were a bunch of cards in the cube, like even Clockwork Servant, right? You're not casting a 3-mana 2/3, you're casting a 3-mana artifact creature that probably you want to be 3 of the same color, which means this card is very rarely going to be worth the cardboard it's printed on outside of mana bases that have 10 of one color and 7 of another, or 11 and 6 or something like that. So these kinds of cards actually put a pretty large constraint on the mana and how badly you needed to prioritize fixing in a way that wasn't actually healthy for the format a good chunk of the time. I ended up having to cut a lot of those and then put in a bunch. That actually helped me make room for a bunch of the more generic cards that you'll find in the cube. Adana Vanguard is actually one where I cut a spell that costs WW. I don't remember the one, but that's just an example of something that made its way into the cube over one of those cards, and that's the most concrete change I can point you to. From the perspective of a fairly recent player, it feels like there is a slight bias for recent cards. Is that true? And if so, is that a conscious decision to help newer players? Yes, Sonitus. That's something that I touched on a minute ago, where I specifically, my first draft of the cube was me going, all right, if I just put a bunch of my favorite cards, if I had my top 600 picks for this cube, what would they be? And I'll flex a little bit. I think I know a lot of Magic cards and have been playing pretty consistently for, Jesus Christ, almost 20 years now. And as a result of playing for so long, I have a lot of fond memories and attachments to a lot of cards that a lot of people have never heard of before. Like Arcbound Stinger is one of my favorite cards in the cube. I remember my friend Randy, who taught me to play, had a foil copy of Arcbound Stinger, and I just thought it was the cutest card, and I wanted one, and I'm so happy that I have built a cube where this card is playable. Arcbound Stinger is cool, but it's not something that any player who started in the last like 10 years is going to have heard of, right? So whenever you have players sitting down, most of which who have played much less time than you, sitting down to play your cube, and you're trying to make them have fun from start to finish, I don't want players to open up a booster pack of 15 cards and have to read 12 of them and have 60 seconds to decide which one is the best one, right? That's just not actually a very fun experience. So having a good chunk of cards like that people just know, like let's say half the pack is cards that are fairly familiar or somewhat recent, is a great place to be, I think, as far as giving players a sort of, oh yeah, sure, I know Terramander, cool. Oh yeah, War of the Spark Tybalt, I know that one, cool. Pelt Collector, love that. What? Okay, what is Kadina's Silencer? Okay, sure. Okay, yeah, and I know that one, but I just don't want people to feel stressed while drafting this, but I do want them to feel like they're doing something they've never done before, and that's a hard balance to strike. I think it just means that I need to pick my spots for where that unfamiliarity is. Do I have to search old cards so that the cube is not 90% historic? I mean, I searched. I used Scryfall for almost every step of it to make sure, but if you had asked me to recite the card text on any random card in the stream, I would have, or any random card in the Proliferate Cube, I think even before working on this, I think I would have been able to tell you the Oracle text on probably 590 to 595 of them, or something like that. Were there any cards besides Planeswalkers that were cut due to power level reasons or that I wanted to include but didn't? Yes, actually. So I assume you're referencing a tweet that I had earlier today. So I'm going to just go ahead and put that one up on the screen because it's a great way for me to just not forget any of the cards. So on the note of blue and green cards, so I don't actually think that having a bunch of super powerful cards is inherently a good thing. I think there are a lot of cards that people are tired of and are glad that they don't have to play against anymore. So something like Nissa Who Shakes the World was actually in the cube for a very long time. Let me see how recently I cut that one. Oh no, it was way after those. Hold on, let's go to page 2. There's no way it was page 1. Maybe I'm just missing it. Whatever, it's not that relevant, but basically very close. Oh, this is because this is the wrong one. That makes sense. I'm probably just going too far down this rabbit hole and it just doesn't actually matter that much, but there we go. Nope, that's Nissa of Shadowed Bows. Come on now, be reasonable. Anyway, whatever. Nissa Who Shakes the World made it very deep into my cube because I was just like, I mean, she puts the counters on things, she ramps, she does everything that you want a card to do in the cube, but the thing is just that you don't want people to feel exhausted when they're playing your cube. And around the time I had to submit this was right before rotation, and people were tired of Nissa Who Shakes the World. I'm still tired of Nissa Who Shakes the World, I'm gonna be honest. So having cards like Nissa, like Hydroid Krasis, not in the cube was a conscious decision where I pointedly wanted the people to come out of games, even if they lost, thinking that something interesting happened, right? Where the gameplay was compelling. They might be salty over it, but there's something kind of cool about being, I mean, maybe cool is wrong, but if someone's salty, they're just like, God, I can't believe they had Arcbound Ravager to pair with their Tireless Tracker, because then they were able to put counters on their Ginger Brute. It's just like, Yeah, I mean, that's just like, that's pretty interesting. But having games that come down to, yeah, they played a Nissa Who Shakes the World, and I couldn't never killed it, and then they proliferated the counters on the lands. So, uh, I died to Nissa. Is like, we've heard that story before, right? That's just not compelling. Similar stories can be said about Oko, about Dak Faden, about Duretti and Genius Iconoclast, and Ugin the Spirit Dragon. And then I decided I didn't want Tanglewire in the cube. I originally had it in the cube, but I ended up cutting it because I thought it was just kind of miserable in the artifact aggro deck, where the games that Tanglewire was relevant were just not compelling or weren't fun. And having Throne of Geth plus Tanglewire is just not reasonable. You could also end up in spots where an opponent never gets to untap if you have turn 2 Thrumming Bird into turn 3 Tanglewire. They just lose the game. And those games were so unsatisfying that I cut Tanglewire. Skyclave Shadowcat didn't make it in. Well, let's check what Skyclave Shadowcat does. Four mana 3/3. I mean, this card's fine. It just, the problem is just 4 mana is a lot in this cube, and you have to look at what that card is competing with when, like, what you would have to cut for it. So whenever you're building a cube, a format where playing to the battlefield is the most important thing, emphasizing your cheap creatures is going to be one of the most important aspects, because if you have 3/4 drops in your opening hand, I can't say you're dead, but they have to be very impactful in order for you to do anything. So without that card actually impacting the battlefield, it just was very hard to justify a 3 mana or a 4 mana 3/3 that cost more mana to start doing things. So whenever you, especially if you look at the other 4 drops, the other 4 drops are Indling, Kalitas, Trader of Get, Skinrender, and Yawgmoth. And Skinrender is pretty close to just being a Ravenous Chupacabra. So there comes a point where we're not necessarily building everything for power level, but you do have to compare the cards that you're putting in the cube against other ones when evaluating how much they're actually going to be in decks and how much they're going to go, well, I guess Skyclave Shadowcat's fine, but, and then have it be, your 21st card in the deck or something. Did I sneak any pet cards into the cube that are borderline for the theme? I mentioned Azuri being a holdout for the player counters. Oh yeah, I imagine so. So let's go back to the Proliferate Cube list. If y'all will be patient with me while I scan, I'm sure I can find some where I can just go like, yeah, I don't know if this card's good enough, but I'm the one with the microphone, so it made it in. Sorry about this wait. Honestly, artifacts is probably the best place to look. Oh, Phyrexian Soulgorger is one that I'm not positive is good enough, but I could picture enough ways to make it see play that even though I never actually played with it in playtesting, because I could never find one in a draft, and my time was constrained enough that I was more worried about the draft experience and the decks that naturally occurred in draft than I was trying to force them, because that just felt like it opened a whole other can of worms, because if I do that for Soulgorger, then I have to do it for X, Y, Z, and so on. But Phyrexian Soulgorger is 3 mana for an 8/8 cumulative upkeep, sacrifice a creature. For what it's worth, for anyone who's not aware, cumulative upkeep means at the beginning of your upkeep, put an age counter on this permanent, then sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. So, Cumulative upkeep is something that had been eroded in Cold Snap to involve age counters. So there are wild things you can do in terms of eating counters off of them and so on, where you could get some really cool games out of Phyrexian Soul Gorger. Other pet cards. Pyramid of the Pantheon is one I really like that I'm not confident is great, but being able to build a Gilded Lotus pretty quickly with a Proliferate engine is just a really cool theme that I hope comes up, but that card's actually probably just not good enough. But I really want it to be good enough, so... Oh, Lightning Coils is actually one that is secretly a pet card of mine. It's 3 mana. Whenever a non-token creature you control is put into a graveyard from play, put a charge counter on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Lightning Coils has 5 or more charge counters on it, remove all of them from it and put that many 3/1 red elemental creature tokens with haste onto the battlefield. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. This is like the first deck I ever net decked was a Lightning Coils deck, and the card is actually pretty cool in the sacrifice deck. And it's pretty cool as a finisher in red deck wins. But for the most part, I think that the pet cards I included are close enough to playable that it's hard for me to classify them as pet cards because I got to cultivate the gameplay experience and adjust the power level as I wanted to make it to where I think I talked about Arcbound Stinger as a pet card a little bit earlier. And Arcbound Stinger just is a super reasonable card in this cube because I got to choose that the power level was such that Arcbound Stinger is a reasonable thing to be doing, and the synergies make it a worthwhile card to play. So it's a little bit tough to answer that one. Catching up now. Okay, so it looks like we have mostly caught up on questions. I'll give y'all a second if y'all got any more that you want to catch up on real quick, or if I missed yours, feel free to drop that in. I want to make sure. The next thing I'm going to be talking about is how I play tested the cube, and that might be a little bit weird, but we'll see. Do I still have my dual screen set up for... I don't, but that's fine. All right, great. So, for actually playtesting the cube, it looks like people have been drafting this cube a lot, which is pretty cool if you ask me. I feel really good about that. But whenever I would want to playtest the cube, I would... So these are all other people drafting it. But whenever I wanted to, I would do a draft on Cube Cobra, which I'm not going to go through one, but it has bots do the drafting for you, and the bots learned reasonably well. I would then take these cards that I had, and I would export it to Magic Online. So let's just do that really quick, and I'm going to log into Magic Online. I had 2 different accounts. I am I'm not an old school pro, but I've been playing as long as a bunch of the old school pros that have play tested for week 1 events enough that I just have a few shell accounts that don't really matter that much, but sometimes you just need to actually have multiple Magic Online accounts. So what I would do, I think I've deleted all of them off of my account at this point. I'm going to pull my other one to another screen. I have the Walking Dead cards. Nobody cancel me, please. import, draft a Proliferate Cube, which is a freeform deck. Then from here, I would customize the cards and add lands as I wanted. So I don't really know what that would look like here. It doesn't really matter a ton. Let me log into my other account. Just for the sake of it, I'm just going to build a really basic deck. Just real, like, at-a-glance level stuff. I don't even think all of these cards are in the cube anymore. Yeah, I don't think Slith Predator's in the cube anymore. Alright, you know what, whatever. This is 38 cards. I can just make it a 60-card deck. Island. Let's just put 10 in. Forest. Let's just put 10 in. So I'd build my deck, whatever. Oh, I don't have these cards, so I can't actually play it against myself right now. But then I would just go to my other account and then challenge myself here. And I would just play the games literally by myself. And what I would notice, so one, I'm very fast and proficient at Magic Online, which made this a feasible tactic. And I also have just played enough that whenever I would play the games, I didn't really focus on the intricacies and trying to, like, level myself or whatever. There's a point where you're just going through the motions and seeing how well decks curve, how well certain cards line up against each other, if there are certain cards that just completely make all the other cards irrelevant. I tried to avoid that. That's why Nissa Who Shakes the World ended up getting cut, because it just reduced or distilled an entire game to Nissa Who Shakes the World rather than allowing anything else to matter. And that got me a lot of the way there when actually fine-tuning the cube. So these are the wide swath updates that you'll see here. But you can see where I cut Jeskai Elder for, like, I changed Fiend Hunter into Fairgrounds Warden to reduce pips. Solemn Recruit to Recruiter of the Guard. Those are the most recent ones. Cut things like Bogart and Lancer and Thriving Grubs from the red deck because they never actually made it into the deck. That's another thing, is whenever I would build decks, I would see how frequently a card was being left out of the deck, because there was a point pretty early on in the cube's construction where I didn't have enough actual play games of Magic cards, if that makes sense. Like, I didn't have Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile. I didn't originally have Chain Lightning, Fatal Push, Tragic Slip. I did not have very much interaction, and I didn't have a bunch of the more generic, just pretty okay cards that you expect to see in Cube. And that was kind of a problem, because you want to make sure that everyone is just fleshed out decks that get to play in multiple different ways, rather than two players trying to grow their snowball against each other and basically playing mediocre combo decks. You know what you mean? Yeah, glue. That's a good way to put it. Thank you, Dakaru. But a lot of the idea there was just making sure that at the end of every draft, each player had a strong version of a deck that they wanted to play, without just having a bunch of leftover kind of crappy cards. And if some of the leftover crappy cards, like Bogart and Lancer or Thriving Grubs, for example, were left over at the end of every red deck that I built or drafted, then Thriving Grubs didn't need to be in the cube anymore. You know what I mean? Hey, Scary! Thank you so much. 34 months. Appreciate the hell out of you. Spam this otter to give him a handy partner. Appreciate you very much. Hoping to get partner soon. I submitted another application last night, but we'll see. But honestly, that's most of what I did during playtesting, was just seeing if there were cards that didn't actually get drafted very much. Whenever I would do my drafts, I would also go through and let me see if it'll still pull it up for me. All right, so let's just look at this Orzhov sacrifice deck. Okay, here we go. So here's the deck that I built. And then you can actually go to each bot and see the cards they built. And I would build every deck at the table and then play it against each other on Magic Online. And then see, whenever I was building the decks, if there were any cards that just never made the cut or were always bad. Or I noted whenever I was drafting if some card was never actually something I wanted to put in my deck, because there's a point where it's cool to go, wow, Bogard and Lancer is such a cool cut from Future Sight. Bloodthirst is awesome. I love flanking. This is so unique or whatever. But if you're not playing the cards, it doesn't matter, right? You can just go, people who want to see cool Future Sight cards can just go scroll through Future Sight. Cubing is about being able to play the games and doing something and playing with people. So, I think that is most of what I actually ended up doing to playtest to where I got now. I refined a good bit. I had input from a few different friends. Ryan Overturf, Jake Humphreys, Liz Lynn, those are roommate, etc. All gave some input on what I was doing. Wizard of the Coast was awesome in that they had play design test my cube and give me some input on things to change. But I think that mostly covers what I did. A lot of it was just kind of playing games against myself, drafting by myself, and building a ton of decks by myself. And then seeing how many of the cards were just sidelined a bunch and which ones never actually made it into the deck and which ones were actually kind of throwing the archetypes on their back. That was a great way to sort of cut away the fat and render down to what cards you actually wanted to be playing with versus which ones just sounded cool in theory but were actually cards way too many number 1 to way too many number 30 on the cube list that could be turned into more familiar interactive pieces like Pyrite Spellbomb or something like that. I think that actually just kind of mostly rounds out what I had to say about the cube. That was basically the process. Everything I've said here took me around 100 hours or something like that. I spent something in the area of 4 to 10 hours a day for about 3 weeks over the course of 6 months. Working on this. It was a lot. I'm happy that I did it. I hope it gets featured again, and I hope everybody likes playing with it. Are there any questions that I can answer for people before I start to wrap up at least the recorded portion of this? Yeah, Hair Lord. I wish it had been a little bit more, but I would not have done it for free. Yeah, 100 hours is a lot, but it's not like I got my own cube out of it too. You know what I mean? So it's not like, obviously I was doing I was not doing labor for WotC. I was contracted, but I did labor and then submitted a finished product to WotC that, I'm not complaining too much. You are far too kind, Alicia. I appreciate you. Without spoiling the future, do I have any ideas for any future cube projects? This is the first time I have actually built a cube like this in my life. So I think that I don't have any plans at this point. I need a pretty big incentive to put this much effort into something. When for me, Magic is a job, it's work, and not to get too nitty gritty about it, it's hard to you don't hear about a lot of cooks going home and cooking for fun. You know what I mean? Not to say nobody does, of course, but you need to have great reason. And sometimes I just want to play the games more than I want to work on the design stuff. Well, either way, I appreciate you all immensely. Thank you so much for watching all of this. And if you like this, make sure to give the cube a try, provide feedback to Wizards of the Coast and everything. I would very much appreciate it. It's the easiest way to make sure I get opportunities in the future. So thank you very much for all of the kindness y'all have sent for tuning in and everything today.